Albedo's an incredibly underrated character in Genshin Impact. He's S tier in drip meta, and does lots of damage off-field with low field time requirements. Though he may not be at the top of the food chain for off-field DPS, what he offers in his kit is unique within his element, and he certainly is a strong unit, even if he's not used too often. I wanted to wait until Cinnabar Spindle was released so I could make this guide as accurate as possible, and also be able to test the new weapon. So without further ado, here is my Albedo guide covering his kit, best artifacts and weapons, and an overall review at the end. If you enjoy, please consider liking the video because it really helps me out. My name is Braxophone, and let's get into the Albedos and Albedon'ts of Albedo. The first thing I want to talk about is Albedo's kit. Most of you already probably know what he does, but it's important for me to go over this at the beginning of the video just so that you guys understand exactly why we're choosing each artifact set that we choose later in the video. Albedo's elemental skill puts down a Geo construct that activates a transient blossom once every 2 seconds while a character is dealing damage, which makes Albedo an off-field damage dealer. The transient blossom can hit multiple enemies at once if they're close together and scales off of defense. This is super important because Albedo's base defense is really high. The cooldown is 4 seconds, so it's very easy to replace, and it lasts for 30 seconds or until it's destroyed. A lot of people complain about his elemental skill getting destroyed really often, but I just haven't really experienced that very much. Overall, I kind of see that as a non-issue. You can also stand on the construct to have it raise you up, but for endgame content, that can end up wasting a lot of time. It's mostly just there for convenience if you're trying to avoid damage on a ranged character. Albedo's Elemental Burst has a high damage scaling hit of Geo damage, and if his Solar Isotoma is on the ground, which is his Geo construct, 7 other instances of Geo damage will trigger after using his burst. Though his burst scaling is pretty high, it creates a split scaling issue where the user now has to choose between building Albedo to be attack or defense focused because his elemental skill is based on defense. It used to be that there was a debate between the two, but now in a majority of cases, you're going to go with a defense-focused build anyways. And I'll kind of explain why when we get to the build. Albedo's first Ascension passive increases his elemental skill damage by 25% when hitting enemies below 50% health. It only affects the ticks of damage, but not the initial placement. And Albedo's second passive gives your party 125 elemental mastery for 10 seconds after you use his burst, which can increase your team's damage a lot if it's reaction-based. It also indirectly makes shield shards stronger since they scale in elemental mastery, and it's basically like an in-kit instructor buff. For talent priority, you're going to want to prioritize elemental skill and then burst. One last thing I want to say about Albedo and his kit is that Albedo is a unit that you actually do want to level up a lot. Most characters get about 3/4 of their damage from their weapon, but Albedo's skill damage is based on defense, and his base defense increases by a lot when you level him up, so a lot of his damage actually comes from him being leveled as well. If you don't want to commit to level 90, at least get him to level 80, ascend 90, so that way he gets both a massive base defense increase as well as Geo damage increase. That's basically all there is to know about Albedo's kit right now, but we will talk about constellations towards the end of the video. Next up is Albedo artifact sets. One important thing to know about Albedo is that he never really had a dedicated set to him, or a set that was like definitively best in slot, because there were so many different sets that you could make use of, but the most important thing was having good substats so that way you can make him a crit build with also high defense. For a while, Tenacity the Millilith was actually a decent choice on Albedo because he was one of the only characters that could have 100% uptime without having to take a bunch of on-field time, and while he's still one of the best Tenacity users in the game, the new Husk of Opulent Dreams artifact set increases his damage by so much that it makes running that set stronger for your overall team damage output than running buffs like Noblesse or Tenacity. So the Husk of Opulent Dreams set gives 30% defense with the 2-piece set and gives Geo damage and defense based on a stack system with the 4-piece. The 4-piece will give a stack once every 0.3 seconds that on-field Geo damage is dealt, or give a stack once every 3 seconds that a character is off the field. They don't even have to actively be doing damage. Just by having Albedo on your team and off the field, he's going to get to 4 stacks relatively quickly, which is the maximum. Once you get to 4 stacks, you're going to have a 24% defense buff and a 24% Geo damage buff, and it's basically free. It's really broken for Albedo and soon Ito, and you should definitely use it. To give you context as to how much of a damage difference it actually makes, a high investment Albedo could be expected to hit 20k damage per tick in an optimal team setting before, and with the Husk set in an optimal setting with something like Goro, who's going to be coming out very soon, Albedo can be expected to hit between 30 and 40k damage per tick in the right circumstances. The one unfortunate part of this set is that Albedo's burst will do significantly less damage in comparison to other sets, but Albedo's burst shouldn't be your focus when you're building him because he does so much more damage over time using just his elemental skill. Before we move on to stats, I do want to give an honorable mention to the 4-piece Archaic Petra set. I really wanted to have a whole section to cut out and talk about this set because it's really underrated. The 4-piece set effect gives your characters 35% elemental damage bonus of any element you pick up a shield shard from. In teams with only 1 or 2 elements other than Geo, you can reliably buff your other characters. As much as people talk about it being hard to gather shield shards, I've never experienced a problem with it just from dashing alone, and the damage increase is really significant. Husk will be better for Albedo's damage and general team flexibility, but if you run double Geo, Albedo with Goro, so you're not getting the geo damage buff, you can consider using this set to buff your team's damage overall. I would definitely suggest Husk over this, but it's just food for thought. If you somehow have a 4-piece Archaic Petra set that has insane defense scaling and crit scaling, it might be worth a shot. As far as stats for Albedo, it's actually not super complicated like a lot of people make it out to be. As I mentioned before, there was a build called Split Beta where you split your scaling to get decent elemental skill damage while also maintaining decent overall burst damage. But because the Husk set came out and just blew everyone's expectations out of the water, there's just not really a point in running it anymore unless you just want to gimp Albedo's damage. So for stats now, the definitive way to play Albedo is defense on the Sands, geo damage on the Goblet, and either crit or defense on the Circlet. And that's really just going to depend on your crit substats or what weapon you're using, because with a weapon like Harbinger of Dawn or a crit focused weapon, you can afford to go with a defense Circlet and actually end up doing more damage overall than you would with a crit Circlet. For Albedo, you want to have at least 2000 defense when you get him to level 80, and everything after that can go to crit, but defense is never bad. The best way to build Albedo is to make sure that you have 50 crit rate and 100 crit damage at bare minimum. Try to push more crit than that. Obviously, you want to have very high crit stats, but defense is so important that if you're able to reach 50, 100 and you have insanely high defense, you're still going to be doing a lot of damage with Albedo. Only use a defense Circlet if most of your substats are rolling into crit, so that way you can balance out your stats somewhat. One thing to note is that you don't really need energy recharge because Albedo's self-battery capabilities are actually really good, and his burst has a low cost. In the current state of the game, it's more important that you're able to output higher damage with Albedo, so rolling defense percent and crit substats is going to be the best thing for you. Energy recharge and elemental mastery aren't useless, but they're not ideal. So now that we've talked about artifacts, I want to talk about Albedo's weapon choice. One of Albedo's advantages is that he's very cheap to build. Two of his best in slot weapons are 3-star and 4-star weapons, and we'll talk about those in just a second, but first I want to talk about Jade Cutter. Jade Cutter is technically best in slot for overall kit damage for Albedo because of the insane crit value it gives, and because it buffs his attack while you can also still be focusing on your defense build to make sure that Albedo is able to hit decent damage on his burst. With that being said, I don't necessarily recommend giving it to Albedo in comparison to Harbinger of Dawn or Cinnabar Spindle, since someone else on your team will probably want Jade Cutter more. Mist Splitter is also really solid as a stat stick, but similarly to Jade Cutter, someone else on your team probably wants it. So for you guys, I would recommend using the Harbinger of Dawn or Cinnabar Spindle, which are going to yield the highest possible damage with Albedo in the free-to-play realm. Cinnabar Spindle is literally tailor-made for Albedo's kit to help him increase his damage, and it really does help. It's a really big damage increase. And as far as Harbinger of Dawn, the reason the Harbinger of Dawn works is because it gives you such an insane amount of crit value for absolutely free. All you have to do is have your character's health above 90%, and you get crit rate and crit damage out of the sword, while ignoring its base attack because Albedo's scaling is mostly based on defense. Albedo's already not going to be on the field very much anyways, so most likely Harbinger of Dawn's effect is going to always be on, with the exception of some content, which we'll talk about in a second. I want to actually directly compare Harbinger of Dawn versus Cinnabar Spindle because a lot of people aren't sure which one to build for their Albedo. And if you already built one, there's not really a wrong answer because they're both going to be fine, but I do want to tell you guys what the key differences are and which one you might want to build given the current state of the game. Cinnabar Spindle is really cheap to build during the event because you get a 1.5 times XP bonus for leveling any sort of event weapons whenever they're live during the event. So this will actually cost you about as much to max out as it would cost you to max out Harbinger of Dawn, which makes the XP ore investment at the very least very cheap. And Cinnabar Spindle is free to play during the event, so it's super free to play accessible at least during the time of making this video. The passive of Cinnabar Spindle is dynamic though, meaning it's not going to snapshot Albedo's defense stat and can change its damage output when buffs are down, so you can see your damage output change. The other thing to know about this is that it's not very easy to build crit on this weapon because it has a defense main stat, so all of your crit is going to have to come from your artifacts. However, for those who do manage to build crit on it, it's going to have a much higher damage ceiling than Harbinger of Dawn. This means that ultimately your damage total could be much higher than Harbinger of Dawn while using this weapon if you invest in Albedo. And yes, that includes with Goro. Even with Goro, the damage ceiling is still higher. As far as Harbinger of Dawn, it's cheaper to build usually, but as I mentioned before, Cinnabar Spindle actually takes about the same amount of XP as Harbinger of Dawn currently due to the event XP bonus. The only thing that Harbinger of Dawn saves on is going to be Ascension materials. The biggest pro of Harbinger of Dawn is that when its effect is active, you're going to have insane crit value and it's going to be super easy to build crit. But here's the biggest caveat to Harbinger of Dawn. While I'm a huge advocate for it, and I would actually normally say to build it over Spindle, even though Spindle has a higher damage ceiling, we've been seeing more and more content that slowly drains your health in the back of your party and through shields. And to be honest, guys, I don't think it's going anywhere. If you're trying to clear Current Abyss, most players aren't going to be able to keep up Harbinger of Dawn's passive consistently because the Rift Wolves are going to eat your health away down to below 90%. If in the future there are new enemies that also do damage through shields or do damage to the back of your party, then Harbinger of Dawn is just never going to really be able to get its full value on Albedo, and that can create some issues because the main reason to use Harbinger of Dawn is for its insane crit value, and by taking away that crit value, your overall damage potential is going to be significantly significantly lower. With all that being said, in the current state of the game while the event is live, I recommend building Cinnabar Spindle. It's not as flexible as Harbinger of Dawn, and it's going to be harder to build crit for, but at least for the next few Abyss cycles, you can guarantee there being a mechanic that lowers your health through party and shields, and I'm willing to bet that Sumeru and Dendro will also feed into similar mechanics for a while. If you don't do Abyss, or if you're watching this past when Rift Wolves are literally the only enemy in the game, I recommend building Harbinger of Dawn because it's relatively flexible and gives insane crit value, but in the current state of the game, Cinnabar Spindle will be a better overall choice because it has a higher damage ceiling and it doesn't have requirements to make sure you get the full effect of it. Also fashion meta. Keep in mind though that Harbinger of Dawn is more flexible and can be built on more characters, so if you're willing to brave the new Abyss with Harbinger of Dawn and not worry about your health drain, go for it. Now that we've talked about Albedo's build, it's time to talk about teams that Albedo can fit into. Unfortunately, Albedo isn't best in slot in a lot of teams. However, he is fairly plug and play and you can put him in a lot of teams and the teams will just be fine. The first team I want to talk about, and one of the more popular ones, is Hu Tao, Xingqiu, Albedo, and Zhongli. This team is a variant on the free-to-play Hu Tao team that I've showcased using Ningguang and Noelle, where it aims to get Geo Resonance for a 15% damage bonus overall and an increase in shield strength. It is worth noting that off-field damage is unaffected by the Geo Resonance damage buff, but the Geo Shred and shield strength apply to everyone. Additionally, Albedo's Burst gives Elemental Mastery, which increases Hu Tao's Vaporized strength, so when using Albedo and Zhongli with Hu Tao and Xingqiu, you're able to greatly increase Hu Tao's damage output. If you don't have access to Zhongli, or if you're not getting enough healing, you can swap for Noelle. However, Zhongli does shred Geo Resistance, which can really help with your Albedo damage output. Overall, the Hu Tao team is pretty solid. Another team you can look into is going to be the Geo Supremacy team, which is going to be a thing as soon as Ito releases, mark my words. This team is going to be Ito, Goro, Albedo, and a Flex character. Goro will massively buff Albedo and Ito's damage with his burst, and Flex can be any elemental off-field damage dealer. One thing to note with Goro is that only the on-field character can use his elemental skill, so Albedo won't be benefiting from that unless he's on-field or snapshots a defense increase. However, the rest of his kit's pretty fair game. Ito will be a strong carry, but having Albedo to synergize with Goro as well just makes the team incredibly strong. Unfortunately, I can't showcase this because Ito isn't playable yet, but when Ito and Goro are out, I will showcase this team in those videos, so make sure to subscribe if you want to see those when they go live. As I mentioned earlier, Albedo's pretty flexible and mostly plug and play. You can throw them in most teams and they'll be decent at the least. For example, you can use them in a child driver team with Xiangling and Bennett, and while it won't be better than Sucrose or Kazuha, it still works fairly well and gives you a chance to use them and pick up shield shards, which can help just comfort of play. And of course, you can use Albedo's Burst to make sure you get Elemental Mastery bonus to help your child's Burst to do more damage, or Xiangling's Burst. There are also whale teams involving characters like Xiao, Jean, C4 Albedo, and Zhongli, and if you want to learn more about those, I would highly recommend checking out the Kaching Mains Theory Crafting Library or Albedo Mains to find out more information. First off, Albedo's Constellation 1 actually isn't super useful. It helps generate more energy for Albedo, but he doesn't have many issues with battery at all, so this Constellation kind of goes to waste. Constellation 2 is really strong, however. It makes Albedo's Burst do increased damage based on Albedo's defense, which leads to a ton more overall team damage for investment. Since you're going to be building him full defense anyways, this Constellation really increases his burst damage. Constellation 3 increases his skill level by 3, which is already good because that's where most of his damage comes from. Constellation 4 increases plunge damage in his AoE by 30%, and this is a super big increase in damage and makes running Albedo and Xiao together a super good option. Constellation 5 increases his burst level by 3, and Constellation 6 makes it so when a character picks up a crystallized shield in Albedo's E, they get a 17% damage increase, which is also a fairly strong constellation. Overall, Albedo has some really strong constellations, but they're all sort of whale bait since his first constellation is not as much value as you'd expect per dollar spent. For this reason, I cannot recommend that you pull for Albedo constellations unless you plan on C6ing or even going for C4, because Constellation 1 feels like kind of a waste of money. So now that all is said and done, and we've experimented with Albedo, we've tried out his new sword, and I've provided you with all the information you need to know about Albedo and how to build him, here's my Albedo review. Albedo brings a lot of good things to the table. He brings great off-field damage, he's an amazing Geo supporting unit for most Geo characters in the game, and he's stripped out. But while he's very free-to-play friendly to build, most of his top teams are not free-to-play friendly. Does that mean he's not useful in other teams? No, he's actually very, very flexible. He can be played in a lot of different teams to still do decent damage and help the team's overall damage output, and he's a very easy unit to learn and play. As mentioned before with the teams though, one of Albedo's biggest issues is that he doesn't have any best in slot teams aside from Triple Geo, and because of that, in his optimal setting, he's very niche. I still think he's a really awesome unit though, and I really enjoy using him, and though a lot of theory crafters seem to think that he's not super great, I think that he's often undersold in his value, and as we see more Geo characters release, Albedo will just get stronger. My verdict is that he's not necessarily a super great pull for people that are trying to min-max and really just clear Abyss as fast as possible. However, for casual players, I think Albedo Albedo is a very safe bull and can enhance a lot of your teams, at least a lot more than the Inazuma units. With all that being said, you guys, don't take my words as gospel. Everything you heard in this guide is accurate. However, the review is my personal opinion of the character, and you are free to agree or disagree. Most of you aren't going to listen to me anyways, for some reason, but thanks for watching. Let me know if you pulled for Albedo in the comments, and make sure to hit that like button if you've enjoyed the guide. Make sure to subscribe if you're not already, and follow on Twitch at twitch.tv/Braxophone if you want to see us do some live content and variety. My name is Braxophone, and I will see you guys next time.